Hello, and welcome to All Our Little Messes, a podcast focused on healing through intentional conversations about parenting, relationships, religion, and more. I am your host, Veronica Winrod, and I'm so happy to have you here, listening in on my thoughts today. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome back to All Our Little Messes. This is episode number 8, and today we're going to be talking about the origins of purity culture and its impacts on society over the past century. So we're going to start with basically the mentality of where it started, and as far as I can tell, with the research I've done, it looks like really the origin of the movement started in the Victorian era. And when people think of the Victorian era, they think of the tiny waist, big skirt, dress that Queen Victoria made popular back then, which the era itself started in I think it was the 1870s and extended into, oh goodness, I think it was as far as the 1910s, 1920s, I think is when typically they talk about the Victorian era extending. Anyways, but yeah, that was when the movement itself kind of started, and it was definitely a development of moral standards more than anything else. And the biggest thing was the suppression, I guess you could say, of female sexuality, where even things like pregnancy were hidden. So the term confinement, when they talked about women going into labor and giving birth, they didn't talk about birth and going into labor. They talked about a woman going into her confinement. She's going into her confinement. And everybody kind of knew what that meant, but nobody would actually talk about it because, a woman going into labor and having a child, meant that she had had a sexual relationship with a man. So, and, that was not something that was ever talked about because it, again, it was a very prudish era. So nobody ever talked about that. And it was never an acknowledged thing, especially for women. With a man, it was acknowledged. A man had relationships even outside of marriage, and it was just a generally accepted thing, but women just didn't. It was a very, very limited attitude towards sexual relationships with marriage. It was a taboo subject. You just do not discuss it. And so that was kind of the origins of purity culture, because they had this image in their mind of what a perfectly virtuous woman was, and it was this idea of innocence, and she of course remained a virgin until marriage, but then even after marriage she was still perfect and perfectly chaste, perfectly pure, perfectly innocent, which kind of feeds into the whole she's going into confinement thing. We don't discuss the fact that she's having a child or she's even pregnant. Women had to hide their pregnancies if once you got up to a certain size, most women didn't even really leave the house because you don't show that you're pregnant. I mean, and if women did go out in public, I've read of a couple biographies and stuff where they would talk about the fact that women and other people would look away from them in public if it was noticeable that they were pregnant. It was such a taboo thing that you couldn't even acknowledge the fact that you were about to bring life into this world. So the fact that they had this movement in society, basically, of treating sex as a taboo subject. Sexuality was taboo. You do not acknowledge it. It does not exist. We don't talk about it. And it was mainly geared towards women, like I said. So those moral values, I guess you could call them, kind of made their way into like the big revival movements in the 19th century, especially like during the 1960s. And everybody talks about the big tent revivals, right? Like where they would set up the big tents and people would come from miles around to worship and hear these pastors, these speakers speak. And like this kind of movement started in I think it was the late 1870s, 1880s, and they became extremely popular during and after the 1960s, after the big sexual revolution that mainly occurred in the United States, from what I can tell. Everybody talks about the hippie era, but mainly after the 1960s, during the big, sexual revolution, there was this huge reaction to that movement. And part of that was the emergence, basically, of an actual official platform for purity culture, because a lot of these people in the 20th century started promoting, purity culture as something that women needed to aspire to. And so it became popular with people that there were organizations that started popping up in the 20th century, like the White Cross Society, American Purity Alliance. You had authors like Joshua Harris, organizations like True Love Waits, and groups and people like that, authors who started promoting this idea of sexual abstinence until marriage, and just the general importance of purity within Christianity. And so also because of this huge cultural shift where they had this big sexual revolution where people just, and I mean, in my opinion, the 1960s were just crazy, and I think anybody will agree to that. There was this huge cultural shift, and in my opinion, there was a general decline of morals, and a result of that was purity culture starting to gain momentum especially within the United States. And various Christian denominations latched onto it. And there were actually a couple of, not even just denominations, but more of just groups, Bill Gothard and the IBLP kind of emerged out of, they were a reaction of the sexual revolution in the 1960s in the feminist movement. And groups like that, people like him, various denominations, Christian denominations, they started promoting this abstinence-based purity culture. And part of that was extreme modesty. And to these people, modesty was the way to achieve purity. And so you had this huge popularization of purity culture and extreme modesty, and it was basically taught as a way to fix what had happened in America in the 1960s and 1970s. And so a lot of people, they just absolutely latched onto that, and it became a way of life for a lot of people. People started raising their daughters to follow this way of living. And one of the things that people started doing, and this is always, I mean, looking back, and I did this when I was younger, looking back, it's a very odd thing, but one of the things people started doing, especially, and it mainly started in the 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, is when it started becoming popular, was the emergence of purity rings. The concept of purity rings was basically a promise. Some people actually would take vows, but it was basically a promise to remain pure and modest until marriage. And the ring was a like a daily physical reminder of the promise that you had made to God and to your future spouse, to yourself, to your friends, to your family. When I made the promise, my mom bought me the purity ring, and I made the promise along with 2 others of my friends, and like we both had all of our families there, like extended family, like grandparents and stuff. We were Catholic, so like the priest kind of overlooked the entire process and like the prayers and everything and the promise. That we had like these little placards that had the prayer on them, and then we had a card that had the purity promise typed out on it and who we were making the promise to and why, and then we had to sign our name to it, and then they were laminated. And I kept that until I was in my late teens, and I honestly have no idea what happened to that card or the purity ring. Like, I took off the purity ring the night before I got married. I took it off, and I thought I'd put it inside of one of the pockets of my suitcase before my wedding night. And when I went back to get it, because I had this plan, I was going to save it because it was like this black sapphire silver ring. And I had this plan that I was going to save it for my oldest daughter when, she became of age to make that same promise. And I can't find it. Like, it is just gone. Like, I distinctly remember putting it inside that suitcase, but it's just gone, which is probably for the best. But anyways, yeah, so there was this huge like surge in popularity when it came to like purity rings, and it was actually people like Joshua Harris and people like him, authors like him, who they actually like really encouraged and really pushed people to commit to purity pledges. And so yeah, there were like these physical reminders of this promise that we had made to remain sexually pure until marriage. And like, the concept behind remaining sexually pure until marriage and maintaining chastity and purity is a concept I stand 100% behind. I just want to put that out there, okay? I am 100% behind the virtue of purity. I think it is an extremely important thing. And I think our culture in general, society in general, treats the concept of sex and everything it entails. I think they treat it entirely too flippantly. I think it is a very sacred union and should be treated as such, but hookup culture has completely destroyed what sex is supposed to be about. So, like I said, I 100% stand behind remaining sexually pure until marriage. That being said, purity culture and the concept behind it, I believe it had good beginnings, but it has changed into something that is just, it is very, very sad and extremely damaging and extremely harming, especially for girls. I have not met a young girl yet who has come out of purity culture without any like mentally damaging ideas or trauma. And like, part of that is the fact that in purity culture and the way it's been twisted is that girls, because purity culture it focuses very heavily on physical modesty, right? As a result of that, girls basically become the gatekeepers of everyone's sexual morality. So based on how you dress, you affect the sexual morality of the men around you is the premise of this. So if you wear a skirt that is a little too short, say like right above your knees, and a man, and like according to most people, evangelical Christians and traditionalist Catholics who embrace this whole concept, a skirt above your knees is considered immodest, because I don't know why, but it's considered immodest. So if a man, lusts after you while you're wearing the skirt that was above your knees, you are responsible for that man's sin. And so, going through life being told that you are responsible for the sin of lust of every man that, has ever walked by you and looked at you and, thought you were sexually attractive in any way. Like, that is so incredibly damaging, and it completely twists sexuality in a girl's mind growing up. Like, from a very young age, I viewed myself as a sexual object because I was always told I had to dress a certain way so that men didn't lust after me. So men weren't tempted by me, because if they did, then I was responsible for their sin. And so I was constantly like hyper aware of what I wore and how it was going to affect the men around me. Even down to like the way I walked. Like, I had to be hyper aware of how I walked, because if I walked a certain way, if my hips swung too much, that was also considered tempting the men. If I wore a skirt that was, cut a certain way to where it hugged my hips a little too much, that was also considered tempting the men. If I wore a shirt that was a little too tight on my not my hips, my waist or on my bust, that was considered tempting the men. I couldn't wear sleeves that were shorter than halfway between my elbow and my shoulders, because again, that would be tempting the men around me. And so I was always hyper aware of everything I wore, because if I wore something that others deemed to be immodest and a man lusted after me because of it in their mind, then I was liable for his sin. I was going to be punished for his sin. And so going through life with that twisted concept of sexuality and modesty, because again, like, there was no teaching of modesty within purity culture of like true biblical modesty. And that also is an extremely problematic thing, like not being taught what true modesty is. I mean, even throughout the Bible, you look up any quote on modesty, there is only one quote that you can find that actually talks about the outward appearance of someone. And that is the quote where they say, they talk about not wearing a man's garment and a man not wearing a woman's garment. And that is the only quote that I could ever find talking about the outward appearance of the woman. And beyond not adorning ourselves with the costly jewelry or gold or pearls or the costly apparel or something like that. They always talked about a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised, or a beautiful woman is one with discretion. In 1 Samuel 16:7, they talk about the Lord not looking upon his appearance or the height of his stature, but the Lord looking upon the state of the man's heart. They talk about the woman adorning herself with good works and self-control and godliness and things like that. The only verse that I could find where it talks about a woman wearing a specific type of garment is in Deuteronomy 22:5, where it says, "A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." And that is actually generally accepted to be talking about transvestites, and which in today's culture would be talking about transsexuals. And that is the only verse that deals with women putting on a man's clothes, which, in modesty culture, they're generally talking about women wearing jeans, women wearing pants, and things like that. And so, yeah, this whole idea of modesty being being entirely about your outward appearance has been like, and you being responsible for a man's sin because of it, is just so twisted and so damaging, and it's just so hard to grow up with, because from a very young age, I'm talking like 8 or 9 years old, this was what was taught to me. And so, from as far back as I can remember, like, I was always hyper aware of how I walked and how I dressed and even how I spoke to men, because like even being overly friendly you could be accused of being flirtatious, which would be then construed to be tempting the men. And so it was difficult to come from that to where I am now, where I'm just like, modesty isn't all about what you put on the outside. A lot of the most immodest girls I knew growing up, they had sleeves to their wrists and skirts down to their ankles. Modesty has nothing to do with your outside appearance, and it has everything to do with the virtues that you have inside. Now, the virtues you have inside, if they're practiced properly, will be exhibited by your outward appearance and by how you carry yourself, how you treat others, and how you worship God, and how you speak to children, and how you regulate your emotions. And like all of that is the outward appearance of modesty. That is what modesty is. And like I mentioned earlier, that is what is talked about in the Bible. A beautiful woman is one with discretion. The Lord looks upon our hearts. Things like that. Like, do not let your adorning be external. Like they said, do not let your adorning be external. We adorn our souls with purity. We adorn our souls with chasteness and things like that. And here's a verse I actually really love, was 1 Timothy 2, verse 8 through 10. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. And so even then, it's saying that modesty is self-control, and is godliness, and is good works. It is not braided hair, gold, pearls, and costly attire. So it has nothing to do with our outward appearance. Our outward appearance is a result of what is inside. And so purity culture, focusing so heavily on the outward appearance of modesty as, being the remedy to the sexual revolution of the 1960s, it was insane. It was insane, because that's not going to fix it, as we can see, because, evangelical Christians and traditionalist Catholics, they will deny this till they're blue in the face, but it doesn't take a whole lot of research to see that this is a problem. But, sexual sin is a huge thing. It's very much covered up and swept under the rug, but sexual sin is huge in these circles. It's huge because modesty being pushed as, an outward appearance and as the remedy to sexual sin has hypersexualized women to such a point that that's all we're seen as. That's all we're seen as. We're seen as the gatekeepers to a man's sexual morality, and, if a man sexually sins, then we didn't gatekeep properly, and it's our fault. So, yeah, it's very harmful. And there's a lot of shame and guilt that women have to deal with on a daily basis as a result of this. And another thing that has been a result of purity culture is, and this is goes back to its origins in the Victorian era, is the fact that we talk about women tempting men, we talk about us being responsible for a man's sexual sin and all that stuff, but we don't actually talk about sex. We never talk about it. And as a result of never talking about it, there is a huge lack of actual sex education within traditionalist circles. And that's a problem, because so we already have this unrealistic expectation of purity. We already have this hypersexualization of women. And then you throw on top of that this lack of sex education. Kids are curious. Kids are they're gonna want to find out what's happening to their bodies, why it's happening. And they're going to go looking in places that aren't the best. Internet, they're going to talk to their friends. They're going to read books they check out from the library or whatever. And they're going to, as a result of all of this, they're going to have a very twisted idea of what sexuality really is, which is also going to feed back into the problem of this hypersexualization of girls and women and this unrealistic expectation of sex and purity within fundamentalist and traditionalist circles. So this is something that it needs to be talked about more. It needs to be worked on. Like, this is not a small problem, and it's not going away anytime soon unless people actually start discussing it. And I'm talking about people within Christianity and within Catholicism. Like, this has to be talked about. This needs to be discussed. People need to start being more open with their children. They need to start actually looking into what the Bible says about modesty. They need to start actually practicing true purity and true modesty within themselves and within their families, not just, forcing unrealistic standards of dress and modesty on their children. This needs to be done. Like, people need to actually start living true Christian lives. This is because purity culture is not what it's turned into is not truly Christian. It is not in any way, shape, or form. Women should not be forced to be the gatekeepers of a man's sexual purity. It is not our job to make sure that you maintain self-control. That's not my job. My job is my soul. My job is my sexual purity. Your job is yours. And the fact that purity culture basically forces women to gatekeep men's sexual purity is just sick, and it needs to stop. I hope you enjoyed this episode on purity culture and its origins, and just a brief introduction into my experience with purity culture. This is basically the start of a short series I will be doing on purity culture, and I will be interviewing different people throughout the course of the next month or two who have had experience with purity culture, its impacts on their lives and what their thoughts are, and how they're trying to break the cycles of purity culture within their families, and how they're introducing like sex education to their kids, and so on and so forth. Like I said before, this is something that is a huge problem. It's a generational problem, and it needs to stop. And it starts with how we introduce sexuality to our kids and how we are teaching true purity and modesty to our children. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you guys all next week. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of All Our Little Messes. Please let us know how much you enjoyed it below, and add any questions you have about this episode. Also, don't forget to follow us on Patreon for amazing exclusive perks, including early access to podcast episodes and bonus episodes every month. We've also recently added a support group for all of our paid patrons. You can check us out on Facebook and Instagram for daily updates and insights that mirror podcast topics. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.